You know what hurts more than being betrayed by a stranger? When your own family looks you in the eye and tells you you're not one of them. That's exactly what my daughter-in-law said to me one Sunday afternoon while we were having dinner at my son's house. "You're not real family," she said. Just like that. No hesitation, no apology afterward. I laughed at first because I thought it was a joke, but the silence that followed told me she meant every single word. My son didn't even look up. He just sat there, cutting his food like the floor had suddenly become the most interesting thing in the room. And that's when I realized something inside that home had changed. Let me take you back a bit. I raised my son alone after his mother passed away. Every morning before work, I'd make him breakfast, iron his uniform, and walk him halfway to school just so I could see him turn around and wave before he disappeared around the corner. That was our thing. I built my entire life around that boy. I didn't date, I didn't travel, I didn't even buy a new car until his tuition was paid off. And I never once complained. Because every sacrifice felt worth it, until the day I saw how easily he let someone else rewrite his idea of family. When he met her, I was happy. Honestly, I was relieved. She was polite, well-spoken, and for a while, she treated me like her own father. She'd call me dad, bring me food when I wasn't feeling well, and ask for advice about her job. But little by little, that warmth turned into distance. The phone calls stopped, the visits got shorter, and soon I could feel her resentment sitting in the air like humidity, heavy, invisible, and suffocating. I never understood what I did wrong, but I started noticing patterns. She'd roll her eyes when I talked, she'd cut me off mid-sentence as if my stories were wasting her time. And worst of all, she started controlling when I could see my grandkids. The breaking point came that afternoon. We were celebrating my grandson's birthday. I'd brought a gift I'd spent days picking out, a small telescope, just like the one I used to use with my son when he was little. I wanted to recreate that memory. But when I handed it to my grandson, she stepped in and said, "Oh no, sweetie, we don't need more clutter in the house." My grandson looked up at her, then at me, and I swear that tiny moment felt like someone had erased me from their lives in real time. That's when she said it, calm, cutting, and final. "You are not real family." You ever have one of those moments where the world just slows down and suddenly you see everything clearly? That was it. I didn't yell, I didn't defend myself, I just smiled. Because right then, I realized something powerful. Blood doesn't make you family, and love doesn't make you blind. Respect does. And once that's gone, everything else is just habit. I left early that day, didn't even say goodbye to my son. When I got home, I sat in my old chair, opened my desk drawer, and took out the envelope I'd been saving for years, my will. I had written it after retiring, thinking it was the responsible thing to do. I had left everything to my son. The house, the savings, the lake cabin he loved so much. But as I looked at those pages, all I could think about was the way she looked at me, as if I was an outsider trespassing in a life I helped build. So I made a decision. A cold, quiet, deliberate decision. I wasn't going to confront them. I wasn't going to argue. I was going to disappear from their expectations completely. I called my lawyer the next morning. He's an old friend, someone who knew the kind of man I am, patient, calm, but never foolish. He asked if I was sure, and I told him yes. I wanted to change the will. I wanted every asset, every dollar, every inch of land to go somewhere it would actually be appreciated. For the next week, I went through my life piece by piece. The house that held decades of laughter and struggle, the photo albums, the boxes in the attic, all of it. I started realizing how much I'd built, not just for my son, but for the idea of family. It wasn't about wealth or inheritance, it was about legacy. But legacy only matters when it's cherished, not tolerated. I decided to leave my estate to my niece, the one who used to visit me during college breaks. She never asked for anything, never treated me like an obligation. She just cared. She'd show up with takeout and stories, listen to me talk about her late aunt, and make me feel like those years of hard work still meant something.
She didn't know it yet, but everything was about to go to her. But before I made it official, I needed to see one last thing. I wanted to know if my son still saw me as his father, or if his silence at that dinner table was the new truth. So I called him up, told him I wanted to meet for lunch, just us two. When he arrived, I could tell he was uncomfortable, like a kid waiting to be scolded. I didn't waste time. I looked him in the eye and asked, "Do you think I'm still family to you?" He froze, then said something I'll never forget. "Dad, you're overreacting. You know how she is. Don't take it personally." That was it. Not a defense, not an apology, just an excuse wrapped in indifference. And that's when I knew. I had lost my son long before that dinner. He was just wearing the same face, but the man sitting across from me wasn't mine anymore. I smiled, nodded, paid for the meal, and left. No drama, no lecture. I went straight to my lawyer and signed the new documents. When the pen hit the paper, it felt like closing a chapter that should have ended years ago. But it also felt like freedom. Freedom from pretending. Freedom from begging to belong in a family I created. You'd think doing something like that would leave you bitter, but it didn't. It left me lighter. Sometimes, cutting people off isn't revenge, it's self-respect.
I didn't tell them right away, though. I wanted time to pass. I wanted to see if they'd reach out. Maybe they'd realize something was off. Maybe they'd call just to check in. But weeks went by, then months, nothing. Birthdays came and went, holidays too. My phone stayed silent. Until one day I got a call, but not from my son. It was from my daughter-in-law, and you could hear the sugar in her voice. "Hi, how have you been?" she asked, like nothing ever happened. That's when I knew she had found out about the will somehow. And I'll be honest with you, I was ready for that conversation. I'd been waiting for it. Because when someone only remembers you when money's involved, that's when you finally see who they really are. Next. She didn't waste much time pretending to care. After a few minutes of shallow small talk, she got to the point. "I heard you've been updating some documents," she said, her tone shifting from sweet to sharp. "I hope it's nothing serious." I could almost hear her smile fade through the phone. I let a pause hang in the air long enough for her to feel it, then said, "It's very serious." She laughed, a nervous little sound, and said, "Oh, come on, you know how gossip spreads. I just wanted to make sure everything's fine." I told her everything was perfect, just not for her. Then I hung up. About an hour later, my son called. His voice was tight, defensive. "Dad, what's going on? She said you're removing us from the will. That can't be true, right?" I said, "Son, it's already done." Silence. Then he said, "Why would you do that, after everything?" And I answered him with the truth. The kind of truth that stings more because it's simple. Because you let her tell me I wasn't family, and you didn't stop her. You let that moment define us. I'm just taking your silence for what it was, agreement. He got angry, said I was being childish, that I was letting emotions cloud my judgment. I let him finish, then said, "You know what's childish? Waiting for your father to die before you care about what he's worth." And I ended the call. No yelling, no arguing, just finality. That night, I sat outside on the porch with a cup of coffee. The air was cool, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel tension in my chest. There's a peace that comes when you stop chasing fairness from people who don't have it to give. I thought about all the years I'd spent building a safety net for them, paying their bills when they were short, covering for them when they argued, pretending not to notice when they distanced themselves. And all of it, I realized, came from one thing: my fear of being alone. But being alone isn't the same as being unloved. Sometimes being alone just means you finally stopped being used. Over the next few weeks, I started reclaiming little pieces of my life. I took the cabin trip I'd been postponing for years. I fixed the old fishing dock that had been rotting away. I even started cooking again, not out of habit, but because I wanted to. Every morning felt less like waiting and more like living. Funny thing about peace, once you have it, noise starts to sound like poison. Then one evening, while I was watching the sunset, my niece came by unannounced. She brought groceries and said, "I figured you probably haven't eaten real food in days." She laughed when she saw the stew on the stove. That laugh felt like sunlight. She didn't know it, but she had already inherited everything, and not just in writing, in spirit. Because gratitude is something you can feel from miles away, and I realized that's what I'd been starving for. Not validation, not apology, gratitude. A few months later, I got another call from my son. This time, his tone was softer. He said they wanted to visit, maybe talk things out. I told him, "You're always welcome here." But I didn't tell him about the will. I wanted him to visit his father, not his bank account. They came by that weekend. She hugged me, forced and fragile, like she was trying to touch forgiveness without earning it. I didn't mind. I just observed. Sometimes you don't have to expose people. You just let them speak long enough, and they do it themselves. Dinner was quiet. My grandson, now a bit older, sat beside me. He asked me about the stars, the telescope I gave him that his mother had once rejected. I smiled and told him, "You know, when you look through it long enough, you realize how small we really are, and that makes it easier to see who actually matters." His mother shifted uncomfortably, but my son just kept his eyes on his plate. After they left, I sat down at my desk and wrote one last letter. It wasn't for my lawyer, it was for my son. I told him that love isn't unconditional when it's one-sided, that respect is the real currency between family members, and once that's spent, everything else loses value. I told him that I'd always love him, but I wasn't going to fund my own disrespect. And I ended with one line I hoped he'd never forget. "You taught me something I should have learned long ago. Family is a privilege, not an entitlement." A few weeks later, the lawyer called. He said he'd finalized everything and asked if I wanted to deliver the news personally or let the paperwork do it. I told him I preferred silence. Silence, I've learned, is a language of its own, especially when people are used to hearing you explain yourself. I didn't owe them that anymore. I started donating some of my possessions to charity. The things that carried good memories, I gave to people who'd actually use them. The rest, I packed away. There was something deeply cleansing about it, like each item I gave away took a bit of the bitterness with it. One evening, while I was sorting through a box of old photographs, I found a picture of my son when he was 5. He was sitting on my shoulders, laughing, covered in chocolate from the ice cream I bought him. I stared at that photo for a long time. Then I realized I wasn't angry anymore. I was just done. You see, people talk a lot about forgiveness as if it's a grand emotional act. But sometimes forgiveness is quiet. It's not about making peace with them, it's about making peace with yourself. I had forgiven him the moment I stopped needing him to be different. The moment I accepted that the man I raised was gone, replaced by someone who had different priorities, different loyalties. And that's okay. Life isn't fair, but it's honest. Months passed before I heard from them again. And when I did, it wasn't a call, it was a knock on my door. I opened it to find my son standing there alone, looking older, tired, like a man who'd been carrying the weight of unspoken words. He said, "Dad, I need to tell you something." His voice cracked when he spoke. And in that moment, I didn't know whether it would be an apology or another excuse. But what he said next changed everything. He said, "She left me." Just like that. No build-up, no preface, just truth dropping between us like a stone. I stood there for a second, unsure what to feel. Pity? Satisfaction? Maybe both. I stepped aside and told him to come in. He sat down on the same couch where he'd once refused to look at me, and for the first time in years, the silence between us didn't feel hostile. It felt heavy, but honest. He explained everything. How the marriage had been falling apart for months, how he'd tried to keep it together for the kids, how she'd grown colder, more controlling, and how, eventually, she'd told him the same thing she once told me: "You're not real family." It hit him differently then. He said he finally understood how I must have felt that day at the dinner table. That kind of understanding, though late, has a strange power. It softens you. I didn't gloat. I didn't say, "I told you so." I just listened. He looked down at his hands and said, "Dad, I messed up. I should have defended you. I let her twist everything, and I didn't stop it. I thought keeping the peace meant staying silent, but all it did was break what mattered most." Then he said something I hadn't expected. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I want to try again, if you'll let me." I just nodded, because forgiveness doesn't always need words. It's not about pretending it didn't happen. It's about not letting it define what happens next. We talked for hours that night, about Mom, about life, about how time slips away while you're busy choosing who to listen to. He cried a bit, so did I. And by the end, it felt like maybe, just maybe, I got a small part of my son back. Over the next few months, he started visiting often, just him and the kids. He'd help fix things around the house, mow the lawn, bring groceries. Not out of guilt, at least not entirely, but out of something deeper, awareness. I saw the man I used to know resurfacing, piece by piece. The quiet, decent kid I raised before pride and persuasion changed him. The one who used to build birdhouses with me in the garage and leave me notes saying, "You're my hero." Then, one evening, while we were cleaning up after dinner, he finally brought it up. "Dad," he said, "about the will, I don't care what's in it. I just want to earn my place back." That sentence hit me harder than anything else he'd said. Because for years, I thought he only saw me as a stepping stone, the man before the money. But that moment told me he finally understood that family isn't built on inheritance, it's built on integrity. I smiled and said, "Son, it's not about the will, it's about the lesson." He looked confused, so I told him the truth, the part I'd never said out loud. When she said I wasn't family, I believed her for a moment, and that moment broke something inside me. I realized I'd raised a good man, but a silent one. Silence is dangerous, son. It lets disrespect grow roots, and I couldn't let those roots spread into the next generation. That's why I did what I did, not to punish you, but to wake you up. He nodded slowly, the kind of nod that comes when someone finally connects all the missing pieces. "You did," he said quietly. "You really did." After that, our relationship began to feel simple again. No tension, no hidden agenda. Just two people trying to make up for lost time. The kids started calling me more often, sending little videos, drawings, messages that said, "We love you, Grandpa." It felt like warmth creeping back into a house that had been cold for years. But fate has a way of testing peace. A few months later, she came back. Not to him, but to me. One afternoon, I was in the yard when she pulled up in her car. She stepped out like someone who didn't know whether to cry or command. "Can we talk?" she said. I didn't answer. I just wiped my hands and waited. She looked thinner, tired, like the arrogance that used to shine in her eyes had burned itself out. She said she'd made mistakes, that she'd been under stress, that she didn't mean half the things she said. But that's the thing about cruel words. They don't come from nowhere. They come from character. And once you've seen that part of someone, you can't unsee it. I told her, calmly, "You didn't just insult me that day. You poisoned what could have been a family." She looked down, maybe expecting sympathy. "I know," she said, "but people change." I smiled and said, "So do priorities." Then I told her something that made her freeze. The will's been updated, and it's staying that way. You don't get to break a family and then come back for the leftovers. Her face fell. She started to speak, but I stopped her. "Listen," I said, "I don't hate you. I actually thank you, because you taught me something I should have learned earlier, that love without respect is manipulation, and forgiveness without boundaries is self-sabotage." She stood there for a moment, then left without another word. And as she drove off, I didn't feel anger or satisfaction. I just felt closure, real closure, the kind that doesn't come from revenge, but from reclaiming your peace. A week later, I called my lawyer Etienne. I told him to keep the documents exactly as they were, but I added one note to be attached to my estate, a letter to my son and grandkids. Not a lecture, not a list of regrets, just a message. It said, "Never let anyone tell you who your family is. It's not decided by blood, marriage, or money. It's decided by loyalty, the kind that doesn't need reminding." And maybe one day, when I'm gone and they read that letter, they'll understand what I really left behind. Not property, not wealth, but a standard. A reminder that dignity is worth more than inheritance, and that family, real family, years passed quietly after that. The kind of quiet that doesn't ache, the kind that feels earned. My son kept visiting every week, and over time, those visits stopped being about guilt or repair. They became something better, routine, comfort. He'd come by with the kids, we'd grill outside, talk about school, work, life. He never brought her name up again, and I never asked. Some stories don't need revisiting once you've learned the lesson they carried. It's funny, though, when you stop expecting people to act a certain way, you start seeing them clearly. My son had changed. He wasn't the same man who let disrespect slide just to keep the peace. He'd grown quieter, yes, but also steadier. He'd learned that silence isn't strength when it protects the wrong things. Sometimes strength is confrontation, done calmly, not cruelly. One evening, as we sat by the fire pit, he looked over at me and said, "You know, Dad, I think I understand you better now than I ever did growing up." I asked him what he meant, and he said, "You never wanted obedience, did you? You just wanted respect." And I laughed, because that was it. That was the whole thing. Every parent just wants to know their efforts meant something, that their love didn't become invisible once people stopped needing it. I told him, "Son, respect is the only inheritance that actually lasts. You can lose money, lose houses, lose everything, but if you have respect, people will still stand beside you when everything else falls apart." He nodded, staring at the flames, and whispered, "I wish I'd learned that sooner." I said, "You did, just not the easy way." A few months later, I wasn't feeling too well. Nothing dramatic, just the slow weight of time catching up. My niece came to stay with me for a bit, helping around the house, keeping me company. One morning, while she was making breakfast, she asked if I'd ever consider rewriting the will again, now that things had changed between me and my son. I smiled and said, "No, sweetheart, the will stays as it is." She looked surprised, maybe even a little confused, but I explained, "The will isn't about punishment. It's about principle. It's not meant to reward or exclude. It's meant to remind. When I'm gone, your cousin will still get what matters most, my forgiveness, my love, and hopefully the lesson. Money can vanish, lessons don't." She nodded slowly, and I could tell she understood. Sometimes people think closure means everything going back to how it was, but it doesn't. Closure is when you can look back without resentment. When you can see the wound, remember the pain, but no longer feel controlled by it. I'd found that peace. The house was quieter now, but not lonely. Every morning I'd sit by the window with my coffee, watching the light spill over the garden, and I'd think, this is what surviving dignity looks like. Then one afternoon, there was another knock on my door. I opened it to find my daughter-in-law standing there again, this time holding a small hand. My grandson. He looked shy, unsure, clutching a little notebook to his chest. She said softly, "He wanted to see you." I looked at her, really looked, and saw someone who had finally run out of masks. Her eyes weren't sharp anymore. They were tired, human. I knelt down to my grandson's level and smiled. "You've grown," I said. He nodded and handed me the notebook. "I wrote something for you," he said. I opened it, and on the first page, in crooked handwriting, it said, "You are real family." I couldn't speak for a second. That little sentence, it undid years of bitterness. I hugged him tightly, probably tighter than I should have, and said, "That's the best gift I've ever gotten."
When I looked up, she was crying. Not the kind of crying you fake when you're caught, the kind that comes when you finally understand what you've broken. She said, "I'm sorry." Just that. No explanations, no justifications. And maybe it was too late to fix the past, but it wasn't too late to let the anger go. I nodded and said, "I know." After they left, I sat with that notebook for a long time. The paper was cheap, the handwriting messy, but it felt like gold. Because that little boy had said something that adults often forget. Family isn't claimed, it's earned. It's built through small acts of respect, through the choice to show up even when it's uncomfortable. Years later, when I eventually passed, my lawyer followed my instructions exactly. The estate went to my niece. But attached to the documents was a letter from my son and my grandson. My son's letter said, "You found your way back, and that's all I ever wanted. The will isn't a judgment, it's a mirror. Let it remind you of what matters." And my grandson's letter said, "If you ever feel lost, look through that telescope. You'll see what I always saw, infinite possibilities, as long as you look up." After I was gone, my son visited the lake cabin every year with his kids. He'd fix the old dock, repaint the fence, sit under the same stars we used to watch. And every time he told the story of that will, he didn't speak of betrayal. He spoke of awakening.
He'd tell his children, "My father taught me that love without respect dies quietly, and that sometimes the hardest lessons are the ones that save you." And somewhere, I hope they know, that day she said, "You're not real family." She didn't end something. She just started a lesson that none of them would ever forget.